Ma'am,
We didn't know it was you. Oh, it was you.
Stillwater, 2,247 hours. Friday, October 11, 2024. Naval Amphibious Base, Coronado, California. I walked into a bar and said 6 words to a woman I'd never met, and those 6 words cost me everything I thought I was. I want to be clear about something before I tell you this story. I'm not asking for sympathy. I'm not looking for absolution. I'm telling you this because somewhere out there there's a man just like me, talented, decorated, certain of himself in a way that started to rot from the inside, and maybe he needs to hear what happened to me before it happens to him the way it happened to me. The hard way. The only way I understood anything back then. My name is Cole Raines, Chief Petty Officer, United States Navy. 15 years in the teams, 3 combat deployments, 2 commendations, 1 trident on my chest that I wore like it made me better than other people instead of just different from them. That's the thing about arrogance. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't walk up to you and say, hey, you've crossed the line. It just settles in quietly like sediment at the bottom of a glass of water until one day you tip the glass and everything goes cloudy and you don't even know why. I was good. I want to say that plainly because it matters. I wasn't deluded. I wasn't some mid-tier operator inflating his own legend. I was genuinely good at what I did, fast under pressure, smart in the field, the kind of decision maker who could read a room, a real room, a dangerous room, a room where the wrong call meant body bags and act before most men had finished thinking. I had stacked more operational hours than anyone in my platoon. I had pulled 2 of my guys out of a burning structure in the Horn of Africa when the mission went sideways and command had already written us off. I had made the right call, when no one else was willing to make it. So yes, I was good. And I had been good for so long, without interruption, without a single failure, significant enough to register that I had stopped being able to tell the difference between skill and superiority. I had confused capability with dominance. I had confused the trident on my chest with permission. That is the most dangerous kind of operator there is. Not the reckless one, not the coward, the one who is genuinely excellent and has decided that excellence is a rank of its own. That was me on the night of October 11th, 2024. That was exactly who I was. The rusty anchor sat 3 blocks outside the base perimeter on a street that smelled of salt air and old asphalt. It wasn't much to look at, wood paneling gone dark with age. Neon beer signs buzzing in the windows. A jukebox in the corner that only played things recorded before 1995, which suited everyone in there just fine. The floor was sticky in the way that floors in places like that are always sticky, not from neglect exactly, but from decades of heavy boots and spilled glasses, and the particular kind of relief that only comes when the mission is over and the beer is cold. It was our place. That's the only way I know how to say it. The rusty anchor belonged to the men who trained at Coronado, the way certain corners of the world belong to certain kinds of people without any paperwork to prove it. Green Berets came through sometimes, Rangers on TDY. But on a Friday night after a week like the one we'd had, a week of JT, AC exercises, and close quarters drills, and a full day on the range that had left my shoulders burning and my ears ringing even through the plugs, on a night like that, the bar belonged to the SEALs. Bravo team had claimed the corner table before 2100. There were 6 of us, and by the time I got there, the first round was already half gone. Garrett Sloan, my sniper, had his long legs stretched out across 2 chairs and was telling a story I'd heard 4 times, but it was the kind of story that got better each time, so no one was stopping him. Danny Price, our breacher, was laughing so hard he was wheezing. The other guys were in various states of tired happy, the particular relief of men who had done hard things all week and were now allowed temporarily to be soft. I dropped into my seat and someone pushed a beer in front of me, and for a few minutes I just sat there and let the noise wash over me. The weight of the week lifted. The bar was loud and warm and full of people who understood, without explanation, what it meant to do what we did. That particular comfort, the comfort of being understood without having to explain yourself, is something most people never feel. Not really. And when you've felt it enough times, you start to mistake it for a right instead of a gift. I was holding court by 2200. That's the honest word for it. I wasn't just talking, I was performing. The Horn of Africa mission. The breach call. The east wall instead of the door. How I'd read the structure differently from everyone else. How my instinct had been the thing that kept us from coming home in boxes. I'd told that story before. I'd tell it again. And every time I told it, the part about my instinct got a little larger, and the part about the team got a little smaller, and I didn't notice the erosion, because erosion is slow. Garrett wasn't laughing as hard as the others. I noticed that briefly, the way you notice something peripheral and then choose to let it go. He was looking at his glass, turning it slowly on the table. I filed it away somewhere I wouldn't find it again for months. That was when I saw him. Gerald Calloway. I didn't know his name then. I didn't know anything about him then. To me on that night, he was just an old man sitting alone at the far end of the bar, in the deep shadow where the neon signs didn't reach. He was nursing something amber over ice with the patience of a man who had nowhere to be and no one expecting him. He had to be in his late 60s, maybe older. Big frame gone lean with age, the kind of lean that isn't frailty but something harder, the way old hardwood gets harder as it dries. His face was a map of something I didn't bother to read. Scars along his jaw, hands on the bar that looked like they'd been built for a different century. I glanced at him and glanced away. That's what I did with people who didn't concern me. Quick assessment, no threat, move on. He was nobody to me, a veteran probably, one of the old ones who came to places like this to sit inside the memory of who they used to be. I had no contempt for him. I just had no interest. That was mistake number one. She came in at 22:15. I almost didn't notice her, and that itself should have told me something. She moved without announcement. No one turned, no one tracked her entrance. She slipped through the front door and across the room to a small table near the back exit, the way water moves around an obstacle, not fighting anything, just finding the path of least resistance and taking it quietly, completely. She was small, 5'4", maybe 5'5" on a generous day. Short dark hair pulled back efficiently, no ceremony to it. She wore an olive drab flight suit, the kind of generic tactical wear that says nothing about where you've been or what you do, stripped of unit patches, rank, insignia, name tape. Just fabric. Worn in the way that real gear gets worn, not distressed for aesthetics, but broken in by actual use. She sat down at the wobbly table, angled her chair slightly so her back was to the wall and her sightlines covered the room, and opened a thick folder. The cover was stamped in red, classified. She held it tilted at an angle that made the contents invisible to anyone who might walk past. Then she started reading. She didn't look up. She didn't scan the room for familiar faces. Didn't signal the bartender right away. Didn't check her phone. Didn't do any of the small territorial things that people do when they enter a space and want to establish their presence. She simply began working with the focus of someone who had a limited amount of time and intended to use all of it. I watched her for maybe 4 seconds. Then I watched Garrett Sloan watch her, and then I watched him look at me, and then I watched the specific expression on his face, the cautious one, the one that said, "Let me redirect this before it becomes something." He said, "Leave it alone, Cole." 4 words. Garrett never wasted words. That was part of what made him a good sniper. He had an economy about him that I respected in the field and ignored everywhere else. "I'm just looking," I said. "No, you're not," he said. He was right, I wasn't. There was something that happened to me in bars in the years before that October that I am not proud of and not going to excuse. When I felt the particular combination of physical exhaustion and social adrenaline that a Friday night at the Anchor always produced, I got territorial in ways that had nothing to do with actual threat. I tested people. I approached strangers and used the full weight of who I was, the trident, the bearing, the controlled confidence that 15 years of hard training puts into your posture whether you want it there or not. I used all of that to see how people responded. Not out of cruelty exactly, more out of boredom. The specific boredom of a man who hasn't been genuinely challenged in a long time and has started poking at the world to see if anything will push back. She didn't belong in that bar. That was my read. Not in the way that mattered to me, not part of the fraternity, not one of us. The flight suit wasn't fooling me. Any civilian contractor could get their hands on field gear. The classified folder was probably budget projections or logistics assessments or whatever the Pentagon sent its administrative people out to look busy with. She was somebody's analyst, maybe? Public affairs, intel support, a visitor in a place that belonged to real operators. That was my read. I was wrong about every single part of it. I stood up. I remember the walk across the bar with a detail that I'm still not sure is memory or reconstruction, the way significant moments tend to blur at the edges and sharpen at the center when you go back to them later. The room was loud. The jukebox was doing something with gaiters. I cast a shadow across her table before I got there, and she didn't look up. She turned a page. I cleared my throat, loud enough that it cut through the jukebox. Several people nearby went quiet. She finished the line she was reading. Then she slowly closed the folder, set it flat on the table, placed her palm on top of it, and looked up at me. I have tried many times to describe what I saw when she looked at me, and I keep running into the limitations of language. Her eyes were gray. That's the factual part. Light gray, almost colorless, in the low light of the bar, the kind of eyes that seem to absorb everything and give nothing back. There was no fear in them. That was the first thing I registered, and the thing that should have stopped me completely. Because in my experience, when people who aren't operators look up at an operator in a setting like that, there is always at least a trace of something: deference, discomfort, the faint mammalian response to being approached by something larger and more dangerous than yourself. She had none of that. What she had was something I can only describe as patience. The patience of someone who has seen this before, who knows exactly how it ends, and who has chosen to let it play out because the outcome is already decided. I didn't read it correctly at the time. "You know this is an operator's bar," I said. I kept my voice conversational, the tone I used when I wanted to seem reasonable, while making it clear I wasn't offering a choice. "The gift shop's 3 blocks down. You might be more comfortable there." She looked at me for a moment. Then she said, "I'm comfortable where I am, Chief." The way she said chief, not dismissive, not aggressive, flat and precise, the way you say a title when it's purely informational, when there's no warmth in it, because warmth would be inaccurate. She knew my rank without asking. I filed that away with everything else I wasn't paying enough attention to. "Just looking out for you," I said. "Things get rowdy in here. We wouldn't want anything happening to your paperwork." I nodded toward the folder. "Secretary's hours are probably over anyway, right? Or are you public affairs? Here to get some photos of the real talent." The bar had gone quiet around us in that spreading way that silence spreads in rooms full of people who sense something about to happen. I could feel it. I had been the center of that kind of silence before. It felt, I am embarrassed to tell you, like validation. She didn't react to the word secretary, didn't flinch at it, didn't color. She looked at me with the same steady, colorless patience and said, "I'm here for the Joint Operations Summit tomorrow morning. I suggest you go back to your beer chief reigns. But you have a 0500 muster." She knew my name, not just my rank, my name. The confidence I'd walked over there with shifted slightly under my feet, the way the ground shifts in the second before an earthquake, almost imperceptible, easy to talk yourself out of. I told myself she'd seen my name on a roster somewhere. Personnel list for the summit. That was the explanation I gave myself, and I gave it quickly because I needed to keep moving forward, and the alternative was to actually think, actually assess, actually do the thing I was trained to do. And I wasn't doing that. I was performing. "There's a difference." "You know my name," I said. "Guess I'm famous." I smiled the smile I used when I wanted something to seem like a joke that wasn't a joke. "But you still didn't answer my question. What's your rank? Or don't you have one because you're a civilian analyst who borrowed a flight suit to feel like part of the team?" She studied me for a moment the way you study a problem that isn't interesting anymore. "My rank," she said, "is not your concern right now, but if you don't remove your presence from my table in about 3 seconds, your rank is going to be past tense by Monday morning." The bar didn't just go quiet, it went still. Someone behind me let out a breath that was almost a laugh and immediately cut it off. Garrett Sloan said nothing. He had stopped watching me and started watching her. I felt heat come up the back of my neck. 15 years of training, and I still could not keep the blood out of my face when someone challenged me in public. "Listen," I said, and my voice had dropped to something quieter and harder. "I've been in places you've never seen, doing things you've never done. I've put in work that you can't imagine. You don't come into this bar and talk to a chief like that. Whatever clearance you have, whatever office you're from, I don't care. Show some respect for what this place represents, or find somewhere else to sit." She was quiet for a long moment, the kind of quiet that has weight. Then she said, "Respect is earned, Chief. It isn't pinned to your chest." She reopened her folder. She went back to reading. I stood there for a moment that lasted longer than I can accurately measure. Then Garrett was at my elbow, his hand on my arm, his voice low. "Come on, Commander Walsh is watching. It's not worth it." I looked at Walsh across the room. He was watching us with the expression of a man who is trying to decide whether to intervene and hoping not to have to. I pointed at her. "I'm ashamed of that part. The finger, the gesture, the size of it." "I'll see you around base," I said. "And when I do, you'd better go sit down, Chief." She didn't look up. I went back to my table. I told myself I'd won. I told myself she was nobody, that she'd be gone by morning, that the whole thing was already behind me. I drank the rest of my beer. I told another story. The guys laughed, or most of them did. Garrett was quiet. I didn't ask him why. What I did not see, what I was not positioned to see, because I was performing for my table and not paying attention to the rest of the room, was what happened at the far end of the bar. The old man in the deep shadows stood up. Gerald Calloway set down his glass of amber over ice. He moved across the room with the careful deliberateness of a man who has learned to manage a body that has been through more than bodies are meant to survive. He walked to her table. He didn't sit down. He reached into the breast pocket of his jacket, took out a small, folded piece of paper, and set it on the table beside her folder without a word. He stood there for a moment. She looked up at him. Something passed between them that I would not have understood even if I'd been watching closely. He nodded once. She nodded back. He returned to his seat. I found out later, months later, from Garrett, who had seen it and filed it away with the same quiet efficiency he applied to everything that she opened the folded paper. Read the single line written on it, and for just a fraction of a second her composure shifted. Not into distress, into something more precise than that, into resolution. The kind of expression a surgeon makes when the diagnosis is confirmed and there's work to be done. The paper said 5 words and a number. 5 names. All documented. You have everything you need, that was all. Brick Calloway, I'm going to call him Brick from here forward, which is what everyone who knew him called him, had been sitting in that bar and bars, like it, and in office buildings and base housing, in every quiet corridor where information moves if you know how to listen for the better part of 18 months. He had been building something, carefully, methodically, with the patience of a man who had learned long ago that the difference between justice and revenge was documentation. 5 names, 5 officers, 5 cases of the same thing, the same pattern, the same rot wearing a uniform, and a rank it had stopped earning. I was the 6th. I was not the worst of them. I want to be honest about that too. What I had done, the arrogance, the blind spots, the Somalia incident, that I told myself was acceptable because the mission succeeded and no one filed a formal complaint, what I had done was at the less severe end of the range. But it was on the range, and it was the kind of thing that unchecked doesn't stay at the less severe end. It migrates, it grows, it finds its way into the field, into decisions, into the space between a good call and a catastrophic one. Diana Mercer had not come to Coronado to embarrass me. She had not come to settle a score or make a point about anything. She had come because Brick Calloway had handed her 18 months of work and said this one is last. Close it. And because she was the only person in the United States government with both the operational authority and the personal understanding of what it meant to be in the teams who could close it the right way. She had not walked into that bar by accident. She had walked in knowing everything about me that mattered. And I called her a secretary, and I want you to sit with that for a second. Not because I'm asking you to judge me if you want, I've judged myself, but because I think it's important to understand how easy it is, how genuinely, frighteningly easy it is to look at someone who doesn't fit your picture of what competence looks like and decide before you've asked a single question that they are less than you. She was 40 years old. She had spent the better part of 2 decades in operations I was not cleared to know the details of. She had built a unit. She had the Navy Cross and 2 Silver Stars and 4 Purple Hearts, and a badge from an organization so deep in the shadow world that most officers in my chain of command had never seen it in person. She was on that Friday night in October, the single most decorated and operationally significant person in that bar. And she was reading alone at a wobbly table near the back exit, drinking sparkling water, asking nothing from anyone. That is what real looks like. I know that now. Real doesn't need the room to know it's there. I finished my beer and ordered another one and told myself I'd already forgotten about her. Garrett was quiet beside me, turning his glass. The jukebox moved on to something slower. Outside the windows, the California night had gone cool, and the base lights were amber against the black. Brick Calloway sat at the end of the bar and watched me with the expression I would come to know very well over the following months. Not contempt, not satisfaction, not anything as simple as judgment. Just a kind of sorrowful recognition. The expression of someone who has seen the same thing too many times and knows exactly how the next part goes. I didn't look at him. I should have. I finished my beer, said goodnight to the team, walked out into the salt air and the amber light, and went back to my quarters feeling like a man who had won something. I had 237 days left before I'd understand what I'd actually lost. The alarm went off at 4:45. I was already dressed. I had not slept. That is not unusual for me. 15 years of deployments will rewire the way your body approaches rest. You stop thinking of sleep as something you fall into and start thinking of it as something you negotiate, always half listening for the thing that ends it. But the night of October 11th was different. It wasn't operational alertness keeping me up. It was something smaller and more irritating. Something I would not name. I went for a run along the base perimeter at 0330. The October air off the Pacific was cold and sharp and smelled of brine and jet fuel. The bay was black and still. I ran hard the way I always ran when I was trying to outpace something internal, and by the time I'd done 4 miles, the thing I was trying to outpace had simply kept up without breathing hard, the way certain problems do. I got back to the barracks, showered, and started getting my kit ready for the kill house. The kill house sat at the southeastern edge of the training complex, a squat concrete structure that from the outside looked like nothing, a maintenance building maybe, or a storage depot for equipment nobody needed anymore. That was intentional. Inside, it was something else entirely. A labyrinth of configurable rooms and corridors, adjustable walls, pop-up threat systems, hydraulic doors that could be locked or left to swing. The ceiling was rigged with overhead cameras. The floor was marked with residue from 1,000 previous exercises paint rounds, boot scuffs, the dark burn marks from breaching charges. It smelled of concrete dust and copper in the particular chemical tang of simunition rounds, the wax-tipped ammunition that left blue or red paint on whatever they hit and hurt enough to make you respect them. Bravo team assembled outside at 0545 in full kit. Plate carriers, helmets. M4s loaded with blue rounds, sidearms, everything real except the consequences. We were sharp. Even after a late Friday, even with the heavy heads that come from a week of hard training, we were sharp. That was the thing about the teams. You could be tired, you could be wrung out, you could have had 2 hours of sleep and a bad night for reasons you weren't going to share with anyone. You still showed up crisp. Anything less was a form of disrespect to the men beside you, and in 15 years I had never allowed myself that disrespect. Commander Walsh arrived at 0555 with a tablet under his arm and an expression I could not read. Walsh was a careful man, not timid careful. There was a difference. He chose his words the way a good navigator chooses a course, accounting for variables that less attentive people would walk into. He looked at us, and then he looked past us, and I followed his gaze. She was walking across the asphalt from the direction of the operations building. Same olive drab tactical gear, headset around her neck, clipboard in one hand. She moved the same way she had moved in the bar, without announcement, finding the path of least resistance, arriving without making an entrance. She stopped beside Walsh, nodded to him once, and turned to face us. I felt Garrett go still beside me. "Listen up," Walsh said. "Today is a stress test. Hostage rescue. Non-permissive environment. Unknown hostile positions, unknown floor layout, high-value target extraction. You will not have advanced intelligence on the structure configuration. This needs to be surgical." He paused. "This is an external evaluator. She is observing our tactics, techniques, and procedures for the Pentagon. You treat her as a ghost. She is not there." "Understood." "Hooyah." I raised my hand. I told myself it was a legitimate safety concern. "Commander, with respect, does the evaluator know the safety protocols? It gets active inside. We wouldn't want her getting disoriented." Walsh looked at me with an expression that was trying very hard to be neutral. She spoke before he could answer. Her voice came through the range speakers, steady and even. "I think I can manage, Chief Rains. Focus on your corners. I reviewed your last 3 ARs. You have a pattern of over-penetrating rooms before your 6 is clear. Try not to get your team killed today." No one laughed. No one was going to laugh at that. I put my hand down. Danny Price was looking at the ground. Garrett was looking at her. "Move out," Walsh said. "I want to tell you the exercise went well. I want to tell you that I was clean and precise, and that everything I knew about close quarters work showed up that morning the way it was supposed to, the way it had always shown up every other time without fail. That's not what happened. We were good through the first 3 rooms. Stack and breach flow through the structure, clear. Left, clear, right. Move to the next threshold. The pop-up targets went down in sequence. Bravo team was operating the way Bravo team operated when we were locked in, fast, quiet, communicative. Without communication, the kind of unit cohesion that takes years to build and feels when it's working like a single organism moving through space. She followed us. I called her the ghost in my head, the evaluator, the observer. She stayed in our wake, moving through each cleared room after we'd moved on. I checked her twice in my peripheral vision, half expecting the awkward compliance of someone who had been in places like this only in briefings and training films. She was not awkward. She moved with a quality I noticed and misidentified. I told myself it was agency fieldwork, a course somewhere. It did not alter my assessment of the situation. We reached the final corridor at approximately 0627. A long hallway, 4 doors on each side, and at the end, the hostage room. The HVT was a dressed mannequin in a chair cuffed to a pipe. We knew the basic premise. We did not know the configuration of what waited behind the final door. I stacked my team. Garrett on my left shoulder, Price at the breach point, the others in sequence behind. Everything correct, everything tight. I ran the entry rate in my head the way I had run it 1,000 times. Dynamic entry, immediate split, clear the corners before you advance to center. Call your targets before you engage. Price set the charge. I looked down the corridor one more time. Something bothered me. Something in the geometry of the hallway, the angle of the final door relative to the walls. Something I had seen before in a different context. I could not place it, and in the 3 seconds I had to place it, I did not. Execute, I said. The charge blew. The door came in. We flooded through. 4 instructors in padded suits opened up from hardened positions the instant we crossed the threshold. Not pop-up targets, people. Instructors who had been briefed on exactly where we would enter and exactly where we would move and who had positioned themselves accordingly. It was a perfect ambush. Price took blue paint in the chest before he cleared the doorframe. Martinez, our point man, caught 2 rounds in the throat guard and went down calling contact. In the first 2 seconds, we had lost a third of our effective force, and I was behind a wooden crate with rounds coming in from 2 elevated positions and 1 ground-level barricade that gave me no angle whatsoever. 6 seconds. I have thought about those 6 seconds more times than I can count. I know what I should have done. I should have moved. Laterally, immediately committed to a direction and forced the angle. Every bit of training I had, every real engagement I had ever survived told me that the fatal funnel kills you when you stop in it. That momentum is the only answer to an ambush. That hesitation is the thing that zips the bag. I knew all of that. I did not move. 6 seconds. I was behind the crate, and the rounds were coming in, and some part of my brain, the part that had never been truly comprehensively ambushed in a closed structure, the part that had always been the one dictating tempo rather than receiving it. Some part of me froze, not from fear, from something worse, from the specific disorientation of a man who has been good at something for so long that genuine failure has become unrecognizable when it arrives. I saw her move in my peripheral vision at second 4. She came from behind the door frame, not crouched, not cautious, moving committed, low and fluid in a way that was nothing like the evaluator shadow I had been half ignoring for the past 40 minutes. She drew from a concealed holster at her hip. The sidearm came up without ceremony. The first instructor on the elevated left took paint on the visor. 2 rounds controlled before he'd processed the threat. The second round of shots took the machine gunner in the corner throat guard, 2 hits clean. She went to the floor, rolling across the concrete without apparent concern for the surface came up behind a barricade I hadn't even registered as cover, and put 2 rounds under its base that caught the third instructor in the leg guards. The fourth instructor, Sergeant Decker, 240 pounds of former Ranger, who used his size as a weapon in training scenarios because it worked, charged her directly. She didn't shoot. She holstered. In the same motion, she stepped inside. His line of momentum redirected the rifle barrel with her left hand, pivoted on her right foot, and used his own forward motion to put him on the concrete floor with a sound like a side of beef hitting a loading dock. She placed her boot on his throat. She pointed his own sidearm at his visor. Bang, she said. The room went quiet. I stood up slowly from behind the crate. My team was looking at me. Some of them had paint on their gear. Martinez was still sitting on the floor. Decker was trying to figure out what had just happened to his center of mass. She holstered the weapon. She dusted concrete powder off her sleeve with a brisk, businesslike motion and turned to face me. 6 seconds, Chief, she said. Her voice was the same as it had been in every exchange we'd had, even unhurried, carrying that freight of absolute certainty that I was beginning to understand had nothing to do with performance and everything to do with simply knowing more than the person she was talking to. You sat in the fatal funnel for 6 seconds. In a real environment, everyone in this room is dead. You let the enemy dictate the tempo because you stopped moving. You hesitated. I tore off my helmet. You interfered with the exercise, I said. The heat was already in my face. I could hear it in my own voice, and I could not stop it. You're an observer. You violated the safety parameters. This is my team's evaluation, and you just compromised the entire outcome. Whatever authority you think you have here, I think I'm the person who just kept your exercise from being a total loss, she said. And I think you know that. This is my house, I said. I stepped toward her. I was aware that I was doing it, closing the distance, using size the way Decker had used it, and she had put Decker on the floor, and I did it anyway. You don't come in here and play hero in front of my men. You don't get to evaluate something you've interfered with. I'm going to the Admiral. I'm going to have whatever clearance you are carrying stripped down to the foundation. You understand me? You're done here." She looked at me for a long moment. "Okay, Chief," she said. "Let's go see the Admiral." She turned and walked toward the exit. Not quickly, not away from something, toward the next part of the process, the way you walk toward the next room when the one you're in is finished. I watched her go. Something in my chest understood in the way the body sometimes understands things before the mind will accept them, that I had just made the last in a long sequence of mistakes, that the accounting was about to begin. I had been standing on ice for a very long time, and the sound I kept hearing was not the building settling. It was the ice. I want to tell you what Garrett did next because it matters. I found out later. Weeks later, after the initial shock had cleared and I had started putting the pieces together from different angles, the way you do when you finally want to understand something instead of just survive it, Garrett Sloan had watched the Kill House exercise from beginning to end. He had performed correctly as he always performed, technically, sound tactically present. He had taken no paint. He had cleared his corners. He had done in every measurable sense what he was trained to do. After I walked out of the kill house behind her, Garrett did not follow immediately. He stood in the middle of that scored, chemical-smelling room with the overhead cameras still running, and he made a decision that I know now cost him a significant amount. We had been in the teams together for 9 years. 9 years is not a number in that context. It is a weight. It is shared history and conditions that create a kind of loyalty that most people will never experience, and that when it conflicts with conscience, tears something that does not repair, simply. He walked up to her before she reached the door. "Ma'am," he said. She stopped, turned. "I need to make a statement," he said, "on record." She looked at him for a moment. "Walk with me," she said. I was not there for the conversation, but Garrett told me about it later in the kind of flat, careful voice that people use when they are reporting facts because they cannot afford to let themselves feel them yet. He told her about Somalia, the mission in March of the previous year, the breach order I had given without confirmed intel, the 2 civilians who had been in the structure that the intelligence package had categorized as empty. How we had gotten lucky, genuinely randomly lucky, in a way that had nothing to do with skill or judgment. How the formal AARI had filed afterward had described the breach as executed on confirmed intelligence, which was not true. How Garrett had read that report and not said anything. How he had been carrying that for 14 months. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I know, I've had the real report since March." Garrett stared at her. "Then why?" "Because I needed to see who he is now," she said. "Not who he was then." She walked on. Garrett stood in the corridor for a long moment before he followed. I did not know any of this when I walked into the debriefing room. I walked in the way I had walked into every room for 15 years, like I belonged there more than anyone else did, like the space had been arranged for my benefit, like the conversation that was about to happen was one I was going to manage. I was wrong about the room. The debriefing center was a tiered amphitheater. It held about 40 people comfortably. On a normal day, it would be a platoon, a commander, maybe someone from the training cadre with notes on the exercise. The lights were full up. The projection screen at the front was showing a still image from the kill house overhead camera, the exact frame from second 4 of the ambush, the one where I was behind the crate, and she was already moving. The front row was full. Admiral Raymond Holt sat at the center. He was a lean man in his late 50s, with close-cropped gray hair, in the kind of stillness that very senior officers develop, not passivity, but the conserved energy of someone who has learned that his presence alone carries sufficient weight and that adding to it is unnecessary. To his left was General Frank Donovan, Army Chief of Staff, a broad man with a face like weathered stone. To Holt's right was General Lisa Hartwell, head of Joint Special Operations Command, compact and precise, watching me with the focused neutrality of someone running calculations. Beside her was General Marcus Webb, Commandant of the Marine Corps, who had a quality about him that I can only describe as geological, the kind of solidity that makes you feel you are standing near something very old and very unmovable. 4 stars, everywhere I looked. I stopped walking. Behind me, Bravo team was filing in. I heard them slow down as they registered the room. I heard Price exhale through his nose. Garrett moved to my left and slightly behind me and did not say anything. "Chief Rains," Admiral Holt said, "take a position." I moved to the center of the floor in front of the first row. The overhead image stayed on the screen. Second 4, me behind the crate. "We observed the exercise on live feed," Holt said. "All of it." "Sir," I said. I was rebuilding composure in real time. I need to report that the evaluator interfered directly with the exercise. She engaged the instructors. She violated observer protocol. The results of the exercise are compromised, and I'd like to formally, General Donovan leaned forward. He said one word, interfered. He said it the way you say a word when you want the person to hear themselves say it back. Chief, from where I was sitting, she cleared a room while you were using a crate for cover. Sir, with respect, she's a civilian evaluator. She doesn't operate under our ROE. She could have been... She's not a civilian, Holt said. The side door opened. I turned. She walked in. She had changed. The olive drab flight suit was gone. She was wearing dress whites, the full Navy service dress uniform pressed to the kind of precision that takes either a very long time or complete familiarity with the requirement. The shoulder boards caught the overhead light. I looked at them the way I always looked at shoulder boards, the automatic rank check that becomes reflex after enough years in a hierarchical institution. I looked. I processed what I was seeing. I looked again. The boards carried the broad stripe and 3 standard stripes of a Navy captain. An 06, a full bird. Not a lieutenant, not a commander. Not any of the ranks I had been unconsciously assigning her since the bar. But it was the chest that stopped my breathing. Above the ribbons, and there were ribbons I recognized and ribbons I did not, rows of them, the Navy Cross sitting at the top left of the array with the particular gravity it carries, 2 silver stars below it, 4 purple hearts in sequence. Above all of that, there was a trident, the golden Budweiser, the seal insignia, my trident, ours, the thing I had worn like a birthright, like a claim on a higher category of human being, on her chest. And above the trident, a badge I had seen exactly twice in my career. Once in a training briefing delivered by a man who spoke about it in the past tense, as if the organization it represented might no longer exist, and once in a photograph on the wall of an admiral's office that I had never been able to ask about directly. The insignia of the Special Activities Center, the blackest and deepest of the black programs. The kind of authority that existed in the space between institutions, in the gap where official deniability began. I was still looking at it when the 4 most powerful military officers in the United States stood up. They did not stand as people stand when a superior officer enters a room, the automatic rising, the by-the-book response. They stood the way people stand when they are in the presence of something that has earned that response through means they have personally witnessed. It was deliberate. It was specific. They raised their hands in salute. To her, the room was so quiet I could hear the ventilation system. She returned the salute. Sharp, correct, the motion of someone who has given and received that gesture in more serious context than this one, and treats it with corresponding gravity. Generals, admiral, at ease. They sat. She had told 4 of the highest-ranking military officers in the country to sit down, and they had sat. Garrett was very still beside me. Admiral Holt looked at me with an expression that contained no pleasure. Not satisfaction, not superiority, just the serious, slightly sorrowful expression of a man delivering something heavy that he would prefer not to be carrying. Chief Rains, he said, I don't believe you've been properly introduced. This is Captain Diana Mercer. She was the first woman to complete the classified Bud/S assessment program, which she completed in 2002 at the age of 18. That program remained classified for reasons of operational security that are still in effect. She founded and commanded Task Force Ghost. She has logged more confirmed counterterrorism operations than any other active officer in naval special warfare. She is not an evaluator. He paused. She is the new director of Covert Operations. She is your commanding officer's commanding officer's commanding officer. And she has been running an internal investigation into leadership practices in Tier 1 units for the past 18 months. The room stayed quiet. Holt set down his tablet. I'm going to give you a moment to sit with that before we continue. She walked to the center of the floor and stopped in front of me. In her dress white standing straight, she was not physically imposing. She was a head shorter than me. In the bar in the kill house, in every interaction we'd had, I had been aware of the difference in our size as though it were meaningful data. Standing there under the full lights with the ribbons and the trident and the silence of 4 generals at her back, she was the largest person in the room. You asked me a question last night, she said. Her voice was quiet enough that people in the back had to lean forward. You asked me what my rank was. She took 2 steps toward me. You also asked me if I even had one or if I was just a civilian analyst who borrowed a flight suit. The overhead camera image was still on the screen behind her. Second 4, me behind the crate. My rank, she said, is the person who determines whether that trident stays on your chest. The silence that followed was not dramatic. It was not the silence of a room waiting for a performance to escalate. It was the silence of a room that had received something true and was making room for it. General Donovan spoke from his seat. He did not raise his voice. "We didn't bring Captain Mercer here to evaluate your marksmanship, Chief. Any SEAL can shoot. We brought her here to evaluate your judgment. And what I'm seeing is a leader who has spent 15 years confusing excellence with invincibility and has arrived at a place where his ego is a tactical liability." I opened my mouth. I closed it. There was nothing in my mouth worth saying. She reached into a leather portfolio that her aide had brought forward and set a folder on the table at the front of the room. She opened it to the first page and turned it so I could see it from where I was standing. 5 names. 5 names, 5 photographs, 5 thick stacks of documentation that represented 18 months of careful, patient, methodical work by a 68-year-old man sitting in the corner of a bar that I had never once thought to approach. I recognized one of the names immediately. The others took me a moment. They were all Tier 1 to 1. They were all good, genuinely good in the ways I had always valued goodness. They had all been at some point exactly where I was standing now. I turned to the last page in the sequence. There was a name at the bottom, smaller font, a separate category, not an officer, not a superior, someone in my chain, someone below me, a young specialist who had left the Navy 8 months ago and filed no formal complaint and given no interview and said nothing publicly to anyone. Ryan Kowalski, the youngest member of our Somalia element, 24 years old, gone from the service without explanation, without ceremony, without so much as a request that I had ever heard about or been asked to respond to. I had noticed his absence the way you notice a change in furniture arrangement, as a fact, not as a question. I looked at his name for a long time. I am still looking at it in some part of myself that does not close files. "The investigation is complete," she said. She was not looking at the folder. She was looking at me. "5 cases are resolved. You are the 6th and final case. The pattern is documented. What remains is the determination of appropriate remedy." She paused. "I could fire you," she said. The word was flat and clean, not theatrical. "I have the authority to process your discharge before lunch. Your trident, your rank, your pension, eligibility. I can put all of that in a folder and close it this morning." I heard someone in Bravo team shift their weight behind me. I did not turn around. "But that is the easy answer," she said. "And easy answers don't fix the underlying problem. They just remove one instance of it." She looked at me for a long moment with those gray eyes that gave nothing back and held everything in. "You are not the worst of what I've looked at in the past 18 months, she said. "You are not beyond correction. But you are dangerous in your current form, not to the enemy, not primarily. To the men beside you. To the ones below you who have been absorbing the cost of your blind spots without the ability to say so." She paused. "To Ryan Kowalski." The name landed. She pulled a single sheet from the portfolio and held it out. I stepped forward and took it. I read it. "Reassignment, effective immediately. Naval Amphibious Base Coronado, Support Staff Sanitation and Maintenance Division. Duration 6 months. The BUD/S compound. The grinder. The place where candidates suffered through the most extreme physical and psychological training the Navy administered. Not as an instructor, as the man who cleaned it." I heard Bravo team react behind me, a collective stillness that was louder than noise. "You will scrub the barracks at 0430 every morning," she said. "You will sweep the grinder. You will wash the trays in the chow hall. You will be present for every evolution of the next BUD/S class, not as an evaluator and not as a superior, but as a support staff. You will watch men who want to become what you already are go through the hardest thing they have ever done." She paused. "And you will remember what it felt like before you forgot." She looked at the sheet in my hands. "You need to relearn what it means to be at the bottom," she said. "You need to relearn that the only difference between a general and a janitor is timing and opportunity, and the choices made in between. You will learn to respect every single person on this base regardless of their rank or their job title. And if you can do that, if after 6 months you can stand in that grinder and genuinely mean it, then we'll talk about what comes next." She turned to Admiral Holt and nodded once. He nodded back. She walked toward the door. General Donovan rose first, then Hartwell, then Webb, then Holt, the 4 of them falling into loose formation behind her, the way people move when they are accustomed to being in the orbit of someone who sets the direction and the pace. At the door she stopped. She looked back over her shoulder. At me specifically, with an expression I could not fully read at the time but have spent considerable effort reading since. It was not satisfaction. It was not mercy. It was something more complicated than either of those things, the expression of someone who has done the necessary thing and understands the cost of it and is neither glad nor sorry but simply resolved. Chief Rains, she said, ma'am. Next time you see someone reading alone, she said, consider the possibility that they don't need your help. Consider the possibility that they have already read rooms considerably more dangerous than the one you're both in. She held my gaze for a moment. And buy them a drink, she said, instead of a lesson they didn't ask for. She walked out. The door swung shut behind her. I stood in the center of the amphitheater floor with a reassignment order in my hand and the overhead camera image still frozen on the screen behind me. Second floor, me behind the crate, her already moving, and the silence in that room was the most complete silence I had ever been inside of. 236 days. That's what I had left. And I had no idea standing there that the hardest part had nothing to do with the mop or the grinder or the 0430 alarm. The hardest part was what Brick Calloway was going to put on a table in front of me in month 4. The alarm went off at 4:15. Not because I said it, I was already awake. That was how it went in those first weeks. I would lie in the narrow rack in the support staff quarters. Not the barracks I had occupied for 3 years. Those had been reassigned the morning after the debriefing, quietly and without ceremony. The way the institution does everything it wants you to feel, but not challenge. And I would wait for the alarm, the way you wait for something you have been dreading all night. Not because the work was beyond me physically. The work was not beyond me physically. I had trained in conditions that would have made the sanitation detail feel like a vacation if the meaning of it had been different. The meaning of it was not different. I got up, I dressed, I walked across the cold asphalt to the BUD/S barracks in the dark with a key card that opened a side entrance and a supply closet that smelled of bleach and old mop heads, and I began. The first morning I stood in the doorway of that supply closet for approximately 90 seconds before I picked up the mop. I want to be honest about those 90 seconds. What was in them was not humility. It was not acceptance. It was pure, undiluted, almost physical resistance, every mechanism of ego and identity that 15 years had built into me, pushing back against the reality of what I was about to do, constructing arguments, running options, looking for an exit that did not exist. There was no exit. I picked up the mop. The BUD/S barracks smelled of wet gear and exhaustion, and the particular human residue of large numbers of people pushing their bodies past what their bodies believed was possible. I cleaned the heads. I scrubbed the floors of the showers, where the previous day's surf zone sand had been carried in on the feet of men who had been in the Pacific at 3 in the morning in October. I emptied the trash. I wiped down the surfaces. I did these things without being watched, without being evaluated, without the audience that every significant act of my career had carried. It was the most alone I had ever been. That is not a complaint. I am telling you it because the aloneness was the point. Every prior version of my life had been performed for someone, for the teams, for the mission, for the men beside me, for the particular version of Cole Rains that I had been constructing and maintaining and defending for a decade and a half. There was no audience in the supply closet at 0430. The closet did not care about Somalia. The mop did not care about the Horn of Africa. You either cleaned the floor or you didn't. I cleaned the floor. By the third week, I had developed a rhythm. 0415 alarm, dressed in 10 minutes. Supply closet by 0435. Barracks done by 0600. Then the chow hall where I washed trays until 0730 alongside 2 other support staff members who had been doing this job for years and who did not know who I was or what the silver device on my civilian jacket meant when I wore it off duty, and who treated me with the uncomplicated decency of people who have decided to be decent because it costs them nothing and gains them something they can't fully articulate. I want to tell you about Elroy. Elroy Manning was 51 years old. He had worked in the Coronado Chow Hall for 17 years, arriving every morning at 0345 because he lived 40 minutes away and the bus that served his neighborhood ran early or not at all. He was broad and unhurried and had hands that moved with the practiced efficiency of someone who has done the same task enough times that it has become a form of thinking. He did not talk much in the morning. Neither did I. We worked up beside each other for 3 weeks before he said more than 6 words to me at a stretch. What he said when he said it was this: "You new to early mornings or just new to this?" I thought about it. "Both," I said. He nodded like I had confirmed something. "Gets easier," he said. "The early part, I mean, not the other part. The other part you have to decide about." He went back to the trays. I have thought about that conversation many times since. The other part you have to decide about. He did not know what my other part was. He was speaking from whatever his own experience had given him 17 years of 0345 mornings and bus schedules and trays that never stopped coming. But he was right in the way that people who do necessary work without complaint are sometimes right about fundamental things directly without ornamentation in the spaces between the obvious statements. The other part, the decision that the work itself cannot make for you, that you have to arrive at separately on your own time in the closet or on the walk across the asphalt or lying awake at 0400, waiting for an alarm you don't need. I was still working toward that decision, but I was working. The Bud/S class running when I arrived at Coronado was class 349, 71 candidates at the start of Hell Week. I saw them for the first time from a distance at 300 on a Tuesday in the third week of November, standing outside the barracks with a bag of trash I was carrying to the dumpsters at the edge of the compound. They were in the surf zone. I could not see their faces from where I was standing. I could see shapes, human shapes, upright and kneeling and occasionally flat in the white break of the Pacific dark against the darker water, the instructors moving among them with flashlights, in the particular controlled intensity of people conducting a process they believe in absolutely. The air temperature was 53 degrees. The water temperature was colder. I knew what they were feeling because I had felt it. I knew the specific quality of cold that stops being a sensation and becomes a condition, becomes the medium you exist inside, becomes the entire universe, reduced to the question of whether you will keep moving or stop. I stood by the dumpster and watched for longer than it took to put the bag down. Not one of them rang the bell. I went back inside. Gerald Calloway showed up on the first Tuesday of December. I was in the chow hall at 0600 between the barracks run and the tray washing, sitting outside on the concrete steps with a coffee that had come from the urn that was always slightly overcooked at that hour. The sky was the particular gray-pink of early Pacific mornings, the kind of light that looks provisional, like the day is still deciding whether to commit. He sat down beside me. He had 2 coffees. He kept one and handed me the other without asking whether I wanted it. I looked at him. He looked at the horizon. He was wearing civilian clothes, dark pants, a heavy canvas jacket, boots that had been resoled at least twice. The scars along his jaw were more visible in natural light than they had been in the bar. We sat like that for a while. "You're Gerald Calloway," I said. "Brick," he said. "Brick," I said. He drank his coffee. I drank mine. "You set this whole thing up," I said. It was not an accusation. It was just a fact stated plainly because I had had enough weeks with nothing but early mornings and honest work to take most of the heat out of my reactions to things. The investigation, 18 months, the bar, all of it. "I documented what I saw," he said. "Diana decided what to do with it. You knew she was going to be there that night." "I suggested the location," he said. "She chose the timing." I looked at him. He was 68 years old, and he had the quality I had noticed in the bar, without understanding it, the quality of someone who has been through enough that his presence had achieved a kind of ballast. Not stillness, exactly. More like the assurance of something that has been tested and has not broken and knows it and no longer needs to prove it to anyone. "Why," I said, "why not just file the report through channels? Why the theater?" He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "Because paperwork doesn't teach anything," he said. "It removes. You needed to see it. You needed to see her in that environment doing what she does and understand what you'd been looking at and walking past. You needed the context." He paused. "Same as the others." "Did it work?" I asked. "With them." He was quiet for a moment. "2 of them are better men than they were," he said. "One left the service on his own terms and seems to be doing all right. One is still working on it." He paused again. "One didn't make it." I did not ask what didn't make it meant. There were several things it could mean, and none of them were worth pressing on. "Which one am I gonna be?" I said. He looked at me for the first time since he'd sat down. His eyes were dark and direct, and carried the particular quality of someone who has earned the right to say things without softening them. "That's not a question I can answer," he said. "That's the one you're answering right now. This morning, with the mop." He finished his coffee, set the cup on the step, and stood up with the careful deliberateness I had noticed before the management of a body that had been through more than one structural event and had arrived at an accommodation with its own limitations that was neither complaint nor surrender. He had been 27 years old when the truck came through the gate at the Marine Barracks in Beirut on the morning of October 23, 1983. He had been inside the adjacent structure. He had spent the following 4 days pulling men out of rubble that kept shifting, working alongside first responders who arrived to a site that did not look like a building anymore. He had carried the weight of what he survived the way certain men carry weight, not loudly, not as biography, but as ballast, as the thing that keeps you level when the world tries to tip you over. I did not know any of that yet in December. He told me in pieces over months of Tuesday mornings in the same flat, careful voice he used for everything. He never made a sermon out of it. He just told me what happened and trusted me to find in it what I needed to find. Same time next Tuesday, he said. He walked away across the asphalt in the gray-pink light. He came back every Tuesday after that, for 6 months. He brought 2 coffees and he sat beside me and he talked, or he didn't, and when he talked, it was never about me directly. It was about Beirut. It was about Desert Storm. It was about the decisions he had made that he still lived with and the decisions he had not made that he lived with more. He never once told me what I should do. He just kept showing me what it cost when someone didn't. That is a form of teaching that I did not know existed before those Tuesday mornings. I had been taught by instructors who corrected, evaluated, ranked, and qualified. I had been taught by experience which corrects through consequence. Brick taught by proximity and honesty, by sitting beside someone in the early light and telling the truth about his own life without dressing it up or drawing a lesson from it. He trusted me to find the lesson myself. That trust extended without announcement, without ceremony, was the most significant thing anyone did for me in those 6 months. I did not tell him that until much later. It was week 9 when I found him. His name was Marcus Holloway. He was 22 years old from Harlan County, Kentucky, a fact I learned in the 60 seconds of practical exchange before the moment I'm about to describe. Because when he told me where he was from, something moved in my chest that I could not immediately account for. My father had been from Harlan County. So had my uncle. So had a cousin I had not spoken to in 11 years, whose youngest son, I had been told in a brief text from my aunt the previous spring, had enlisted in the Navy. I looked at Marcus Holloway in the dark outside the barracks, and I did the math quietly, and I did not say anything about it because it was not the relevant fact. But it was present, the way certain things are present when the world arranges itself into something that is not coincidence, but is not quite explicable either. His blood was not mine, but it was close enough to make the moment feel like something other than accident. He was sitting on the concrete barrier at the back corner of the barracks at 02:15. Not standing, sitting elbows on his knees, head down, hands loose between them. He was in his PT gear, and he had been in the surf zone 4 hours earlier with the rest of Class 349, and he was breathing like someone who had been in the surf zone 4 hours earlier. Not from exertion, but from something else. I stopped. I did not want to stop. My instinct, 15 years of it, was to note his position, identify that he was physically present and not in medical distress, and keep walking. My instinct was to let someone whose job it was handle that category of problem. Ryan Kowalski had been 24 years old when he left the Navy quietly without filing anything, without explaining to anyone why. I stopped. I sat down on the barrier about 3 feet from Holloway, not close enough to crowd him, close enough to be undeniable. He did not look up. "You're thinking about the bell," I said. He was quiet for a moment. "No," he said. "Okay," I said. "Another moment." "Maybe," he said. I did not tell him to push through. I did not give him a speech about the Trident or the Brotherhood or any of the large abstractions that I had previously believed were the correct currency for moments like this one. Those things were real. I still believed they were real, but they were not what this moment needed. I told him about the time I wanted to quit, not BUD/S. Later than that. A deployment in a period I will not specify in a location I will not name, when a decision I had made had resulted in an outcome that I had to write a report about and then carry home and put in the part of myself that does not file and does not close. When I had sat in a forward operating base somewhere that smelled of dust and altitude and considered for the first and only time before those 6 months on the grinder whether I was actually the person I believed I was. I told him about a man in my unit who had sat beside me that night, not to give a speech, not to correct my thinking, just to be present in the way that presence alone sometimes constitutes the entire needed intervention. He didn't say much, I told Holloway, but he stayed. That was the thing. He just stayed. Holloway lifted his head. He looked at me with the specific exhaustion of someone who has been using resources they did not know they were depleting. "It doesn't get easier," I said. "The early mornings, I mean." Something in him recognized the reference even though he didn't know its origin. "What about the other part?" he said. "The other part you have to decide about," I said. "But you decide it by staying in the seat. Not all at once, just tonight." He was quiet for a long time. Okay, he said. He went back inside. He did not ring the bell. I sat on that concrete barrier for a while after he was gone in the cold and the dark with the sound of the Pacific carrying over the base perimeter from the west. I thought about Ryan Kowalski. I thought about the decision that the work itself cannot make for you. I thought about what Elroy had said at the trace station and what it meant to decide about the other part. I thought about her. In month 4 on a Tuesday in January, Brick put a piece of paper on the step between us. He did not say anything. He set it down and picked up his coffee and looked at the horizon. I looked at the paper. It was a photocopy. The original document had been printed on Navy letterhead dated March 14, 2012. It was a brief administrative memo, the kind of internal correspondence that moves through a chain of command quickly and without ceremony, carrying decisions that affect careers in the same tone used to schedule maintenance windows. The subject line read retention, recommendation, CPO candidate. 5 reigns. I had been 30 years old in March of 2012. I had been in the middle of an evaluation period following an incident that I had believed at the time was resolved a failure of judgment in a training context that had been formally noted and I thought formally set aside. What I had not known and had never been told was that there had been a secondary review. That someone outside my immediate chain had pulled the file and read it and been asked informally to offer a professional assessment of whether the candidate was worth keeping. The recommendation was 3 paragraphs. It was written in the precise economical language of someone who has learned to say exactly what they mean and nothing more. It noted the specifics of the incident without minimizing them. It noted the pattern of prior performance that the incident existed within not as exculpation, but as context. It concluded with the following sentence, which I read 3 times before I was sure I was reading it correctly. Subject demonstrates the core capability profile required for sustained high-performance operations, with a behavioral pattern that suggests the incident reflects an underdeveloped framework for ethical calibration rather than a fundamental character deficit. Recommend retention with structured mentorship. The capacity for correction is present. The question is whether the institution will invest in it. The signature at the bottom of the page read, Lieutenant D. Mercer. I sat with that for a long time. She had been 28 years old in March of 2012. She had been a lieutenant in a program so classified that her name appeared in almost no official documentation that any member of my chain of command would have had access to. She had been given a file on a candidate she had never met and asked for a professional opinion, and she had read it and she had written those 3 paragraphs and she had signed her name. She had not met me, she had not been assigned to mentor me, had not been asked to follow up, had not been given any responsibility for what happened to me after that memo went into the file. She had read a document, formed a judgment, committed it to paper, and moved on. She had been doing that for 20 years, quietly, without announcement, in the background of careers and decisions and outcomes that the people involved would never fully trace back to the point of origin. I thought about the bar. I thought about the word I had used, secretary. The confidence of that word, the way it had come out of me without friction, without the smallest resistance from any mechanism of judgment that should have applied the brakes. I had looked at her and decided what she was before she had said a single word to me. I had been wrong in a way that was not merely factual but structural, wrong in the architecture of how I was looking, not just in the conclusion I had reached. She had looked at a file on a candidate she'd never met and seen something worth keeping. I had looked directly at the person who had written that file and seen a secretary. I set the paper down. She never told me, I said. No, Brick said. Why? He turned his coffee cup in his hands. Because she didn't do it to be thanked, he said. She did it because it needed doing and she was the person who could do it. He paused. That's the only reason she ever does anything. I looked at the paper on the step between us. She's been doing it the whole time, I said. Watching, documenting, the investigation, the memo. Everything. Yes, he said, without any of them knowing. Yes. I thought about what that meant. Not abstractly. Concretely. I thought about what it took to operate at that level of patience, to invest that quality of attention in people who would never know you were paying it to do the necessary work in the background without requiring the room to be aware of you. I thought about the bar and the way she had sat at that wobbly table with the classified folder, not looking up, not marking territory, not establishing presence. She had not needed the room to know she was there. She had known what she was. That was the first time I cried since my father's funeral. I want to say it plainly because I think the plainness matters. Not weeping, not breakdown, just the specific involuntary physical response of a man who has held something very tight for a very long time and has finally understood what it has cost him. The tears came without warning, and I did not try to stop them. Brick looked at the horizon. He did not say anything. He stayed. The first time Diana appeared during those 6 months, I didn't see her. Garrett did. Garrett Sloan had been reassigned to an instructional role during my detail, a lateral move he had apparently requested for reasons he explained to me only partially, and I did not press. We had not spoken much in the first 4 months. The weight between us was the weight of 14 months of carried knowledge and one conversation in a corridor, and that weight needed time to settle before either of us could stand on it without adjusting our balance every few minutes. He found me at the end of the chow hall morning shift on a Wednesday in February. He stood outside the door and waited, characteristic because Garrett did not enter spaces he hadn't been invited into, which was a quality I had always respected in him as a sniper, and had not until recently recognized as a form of consideration that extended beyond tactical application. "She filed something last week," he said. I looked at him. "Recommendation for your full reinstatement at month 6, he said, with a performance addendum, 12 pages. 12 pages. I thought about the care that had gone into them, about the fact that I had not been told. "She didn't say anything to me," I said. "No," Garrett said. "How do you know?" "Walsh," he said. "He thought I should know. He thought I'd tell you. He was right." I looked down at the concrete. "She's been watching," I said. "She never stopped," he said. We stood there for a moment, and in the way that men who have known each other for a long time sometimes stand in the space where all the things that need to be said are present, and neither of you has to say them to confirm that the other one knows. "Kowalski," I said. "I know," he said. "I should have asked." "Yes," he said. "You should have." He put his hand on my shoulder for a moment briefly without ceremony, the way you do it when you mean it and don't want to make too much of it. Then he went back to his day. The second time was week 22, 0500 on a Thursday in March. I had finished the barracks run and was walking the perimeter path along the water side of the base before the chow hall shift started. The 20 minutes of Pacific morning air had become the part of the day I valued most and protected most carefully. She was standing at the edge of the beach access about 40 meters ahead of me on the path. I recognized her immediately, even from behind, even at that distance. The posture, the stillness, the particular quality of being completely present in a space without asserting any claim on it. She was watching Class 349 in the surf zone. No one had reported to her, no one had arranged her presence there. There was no review scheduled, no evaluation in progress, no official reason for the director of Covert Operations to be standing at the edge of a beach in the early morning, watching candidates she had no direct operational responsibility for. She was just there, watching them suffer towards something they wanted badly enough to keep going. I stopped walking. I did not want to interrupt whatever this was, not because of rank, though rank was relevant, but because some things deserve to be left intact. Some moments are not improved by witness. They are simply things that happen in the world, small and unremarkable and completely essential, and the correct response to encountering one is to be still and let it be. She stood there for 4 or 5 minutes. Then she turned and walked back toward the operations building, taking the path that went inland away from where I was standing. She did not see me, or if she did, she made no sign. I watched her go. She looked like someone who had made her peace with every room she had ever walked into. The loud ones and the empty ones, the ones where 4 generals stood to salute, and the ones where nobody knew she was present and had decided that her presence was enough, regardless of whether anyone registered it. I stood there for a while after she was gone, with the sound of the surf and the distant voices of the instructors and the cold March air on my face, and I thought about what it meant to be that kind of person in the world. To do the work without requiring the work to carry your name. To invest in people who would not know you had invested until years later, or possibly never. I went to the chow hall. I washed the trays. Marcus Holloway graduated from Class 349 on a morning in April that I watched from the support side of the grinder, standing in the civilian section with Elroy and 2 other chow hall staff. When Holloway crossed, I did not cheer. I did not draw attention to the fact that I was there, or that I had anything to do with the man now standing in formation with a trident waiting to be placed on his chest. I just watched. That was enough. That was more than enough. Elroy glanced at me, once read whatever was on my face, and looked back at the formation without comment. He was good at that. He had been good at it for 17 years. She called me in on the first Tuesday of April. Her office was a room in the operations building that I had walked past 100 times in 3 years without knowing whose it was, because her name was not on the door and there was no indication from the outside that anything of significance happened inside it. I knocked. "Come in, Chief." I entered. The room was spare. A desk, 2 chairs, a window that faced the bay. No photographs on the walls. No plaques or commendations displayed which told you something about her, because people who have things worth displaying and choose not to display them are making a statement about what they think recognition is for. A single bookshelf full, the books arranged without apparent system. She was behind the desk in her service uniform, not dress whites. She looked the same as she always looked, contained, direct, present in the room, in the way that some people are and most people are not. She slid a folder across the desk. I sat down and opened it. Reinstatement, full rank, full privileges. Effective at month 6, which was 3 weeks away. Attached was a separate document, a recommendation for enrollment in a leadership assessment program associated with Task Force Ghost. Not an assignment, an assessment, a door, not a guarantee. I read it twice. I looked up. I have a question, I said. Go ahead. The memo, I said. 2012, the retention recommendation. She did not react to this, not with surprise, not with any visible adjustment of her expression. She simply looked at me and waited. You didn't know me, I said. You read a file on someone you'd never met, and you wrote 3 paragraphs and signed your name. You had no reason to invest that. She looked at me for a long moment. Why, I said. She was quiet long enough that I thought she might not answer. Then she stood up. She took her jacket from the chair back and put it on. She walked to the door. She stopped her hand on the frame in the same posture she had held at the amphitheater door 6 months ago. The pause at the threshold, the final thing said to the room she was leaving. Because broken things can still cut, she said, and you were worth the edge. She walked out. I sat in the chair in her spare office with the reinstatement folder in my hands and the April morning coming through the window that faced the bay, and I stayed there for a while before I stood up. Not because I needed the time to compose myself. I stayed because the room deserved the respect of not being exited quickly, because some things that happen in rooms are worth letting settle before you carry them out into the rest of your life. I had learned over the previous 6 months to stop treating stillness as something to move through on the way to the next thing. I had learned to let it be the thing. I want to tell you where I am now. Not in terms of rank or assignment or the official record which exists in files. I am not going to describe in detail for reasons that should be obvious. In terms of who I am now, which is the only measure that matters when I sit down and think about whether the 6 months on the grinder produced anything worth the cost. I think about Elroy Manning and his 03:45 mornings and the 17 years of honest work that I walked into as a form of punishment and understood eventually as something else entirely. I think about Brick Calloway on the concrete steps with 2 coffees and the patience of a man who has decided that the most important thing he can do with what he has survived is make sure other people have the chance to survive something too. I think about Marcus Holloway standing in that formation in April with the trident about to go on his chest from a county in Kentucky that produced men who were harder than the ground they came from. I think about what it cost him to stay in the seat and what it cost me to stay beside him for 60 seconds on a cold concrete barrier in November. I think about Ryan Kowalski. I think about his name on the last page of that folder and the question I never asked and the weight of all the things we don't do because the doing of them requires us to slow down and pay attention to someone other than ourselves. And I think about her. I think about the bar and the folder and the way she went back to reading after I pointed my finger at her and said something I cannot take back and would not if I could because the consequence of it was the education I apparently required and would not have received any other way. I think about 12 pages filed without fanfare, about a memo signed in 2012 by a lieutenant who had never met the candidate whose file she was reading, about the kind of person who does those things without keeping a ledger, without expecting return, without requiring the room to know. I think about the beach at 500 on a Thursday in March, about a woman standing at the water's edge with no audience and no agenda watching men she didn't know suffer towards something they wanted, about the way she turned and walked back toward her day when she was done without ceremony, without needing the moment to be witnessed by anyone. I know what that phrase means now. The most dangerous operators never announce themselves. Not as a thing I was told, but as a thing I watched from 6 inches away and from 40 meters away and from inside everything she set in motion without once explaining what she was doing or why. I did not understand it on the night of October 11th, 2024. I understand it now. And if you are the man I described at the beginning of this story, talented, certain, excellent, in ways that have started to calcify into something that serves you instead of the mission. If you are that man, I want you to hear this next part carefully. The woman at the table you walk past, the one reading alone, the one who didn't look up when you cleared your throat, the one who doesn't wear her history on the outside, who doesn't need the room to know what she is, who answered your question with something flat and precise that bothered you more than an argument would have because you could not find the angle to push back on. She knows something you don't. Maybe it's tactical, maybe it's strategic, maybe it's the kind of knowledge that comes from doing hard things quietly for 20 years without the room's acknowledgement. Maybe it's something smaller and more immediate, the kind of knowledge that comes from being underestimated her entire life and developing in response a quality of attention and patience and precision that people who have always been given the room never have to build. Whatever it is, she knows it. And the question, the only question that matters standing there with your certainty filling the space is whether you are going to be the man who walks away having learned something or the man who picks up the mop 6 months later. I know which one I was. I know which one I am now. The difference between those two men is 6 months of early mornings and 2 coffees on concrete steps and one 60-second conversation on a cold barrier in November and a memo signed 12 years ago by someone who had never met me and saw something in me worth keeping anyway. The difference is her. Still water runs deep, and the most dangerous operators never announce themselves. They don't have to. The work speaks, and long after the noise is gone, the work remains.